Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over inflation and unemployment and more specifically the Phillips curve. So let's get started right here. All right, we're going to describe what the Phillips curve is and the nature of the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So we'll go ahead and figure out what, if any, the relationship is between these two different items. We're going to understand why there is actually no long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So in the short run, we're going to see this inverse relationship, but in the long run, there's absolutely no correlation. Okay? We're going to discuss why expansionary policies are limited due to the effects of expected inflation. We're going to examine why even moderate levels of inflation can be hard to end. And we're going to evaluate why policymakers prefer a moderate amount of inflation as opposed to deflation. So we're going to look at a case study, particularly in Japan, see what happened there. So the short run Phillips curve. So before we get into the graphs, a little bit more of the historical background. In 1958, New Zealand-born economist Alvin W.H. Phillips, from whom we derived this Phillips curve, he found out when the unemployment rate was high, wage rates tended to fall. So wage rates would be a proxy for inflation. So when the unemployment, when the unemployment rate was high, you had inflation tending to go down. So you have one bad thing, but kind of a good thing right there. Conversely, so if you look at the second situation here, conversely, when the unemployment rate was low, wage rates tended to rise. So let's look at the other situation. You have a good thing here, which is unemployment, going down. But wage rates tended to rise. So inflation increased. So it's a good thing, if you're a employee and your wage rates went up, that's great for you. But if everyone else's wage rates goes up, prices go up, and that's generally not a good thing. So again, this economist saw this relationship, and it was actually pretty good. The idea was that using data in the 1950s and 1960s, the simple negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, again, generally held through. It was held true. It was a theory that worked out pretty well. You didn't see a lot of deviation from it. So this actually worked. So there was no there's no reason to think necessarily that there was anything flawed with the theory at the time. But again, the reason why this was the case was that there was fairly low inflation. So if you fast forward a little bit, the long run, we'll get to the long run Phillips curve. It generally didn't hold true when you extended the time period. But let's just look at the short run Phillips curve here. So you have inflation and unemployment. So there's just going to be this short run trade-off between unemployment and inflation here. So technically, if you have inflation on the y-axis and, if you have unemployment on the y-axis and inflation on the x-axis, technically it's okay to do that. But the standard way that most textbooks are going to use and the graders on the AP exam, remember they're your audience. You wanna make sure that you make it as clear and easy for these AP graders to grade. Again, I was a grader for 6 years myself. You want to make it as easy for them to grade the correct responses as much as possible. So you're going to have inflation here on the y-axis. And basically, it's very similar looking to a production possibilities curve. In fact, it might curve out like this, but let's go ahead and just draw a straight downward sloping line, kind of like a demand curve here. And we'll go through the x-axis simply because it's possible to have deflation. So when you have high levels of unemployment, this represents the idea that you're hitting deflationary periods, which again, we'll talk about why that's not a good thing here. But this is the SRPC1. Okay, so again, a hypothetical point. It doesn't have to be specifically, but let's say this is a 3% inflation rate, and let's say you have an unemployment rate here of 5% in the short run here. So there is a trade-off in the short run. As inflation goes down, unemployment is going to go up. As inflation goes up, unemployment is going to go down. So let's call this point A. And point B, if point B, this might be something like a 4% inflation rate. And let's call this a 4% unemployment rate. So you have a lower unemployment rate, and that's a good thing, but now you have a higher inflation rate. Or you could possibly have a lower inflation rate, but the trade-off being that more of your fellow citizens are without a job. So this is this trade-off in the short run and the long run. And if there's anticipated inflation, then what you're going to have here is you're going to have a shift to the right. You're going to have a shift to the right of the SRPC2 here. So that's kind of the idea of what happens in the short run Phillips curve graph. All right, so inflation expectations. So inflation expectations, changes in expected inflation will affect the short run Phillips curve. So as I graphed before, it's going to shift it to the right. So if there's expected inflation, then the SRPC is going to shift to the right. So an increase in expected inflation shifts the short run Phillips curve upward, or to the right is going to have an upward direction, right? And again, people will tend to base their expectations of inflation based on their experiences. So in periods of high inflation, then people will expect high inflation. So conversely, when people are accustomed to low inflation rates, they correctly reasoned at the time that future inflation rates would also be low. That's why the SRPC generally held true, because again, of the limited experience that people had. Again, they saw that, okay, you have low inflation, you have high unemployment. You have high inflation, you have low unemployment. So that generally held true, but again, that's not necessarily what happens in the long run. So this idea of inflation and unemployment in the long run, it's going to look a little bit different. So most economists believe that in the long run, there's absolutely no trade-off between unemployment and inflation, so that there's no correlation. So on a multiple choice answer, what is the correlation in the long run between unemployment and inflation? There is none, because when you look at the LRPC, you're going to see that they're fairly independent of one another. To avoid accelerating inflation over time, so the idea of this rapidly growing inflation, the unemployment rate must be high enough that the actual rate of inflation actually matches the expected rate of inflation. The unemployment rate at which inflation does not change over time is known as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or nicknamed NAIRU. Okay, so that's kind of the acronym. That'd be kind of a really long term to actually plot on your graph here, but you can actually put the point as NAIRU, this non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay. Now, the long-run Phillips curve, the LRPC, is the relationship between unemployment and inflation after expectations of unemployment have had time to adjust over time. And again, as we said before, there's no correlation, there's no long-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Okay, so how is the long-run Phillips curve and this NAIRU going to look in the context of the SRPC? Well, this is basically how it's going to pan out here. Again, let's label here. It's going to be unemployment on the y-axis or x-axis. And on the y-axis, you're going to have inflation. So let's go ahead and draw the SRPC. We're going to draw it through the x-axis to indicate okay, you've hit a period of deflation, high unemployment, and deflation here. And let's label this the SRPC. SRPC1 here. And the LRPC is going to be a straight vertical line down. Now, put the LRPC label here on top because it's going to represent this curve, a straight vertical line down. And this point right here is the NAIRU, the non-accelerating interest rate of unemployment, or inflation rate of unemployment. Now, what is the NAIRU? It can change over time, but hypothetically here, let's call this NAIRU 6%. So this NAIRU, it's a 6%, and that's going to be the point right here. And let's say the inflation rate here is 3%. So I'm just throwing out numbers. Now, what happens if if there's expected inflation? Then what's going to happen is that the SRPC is going to shift upwards or to the right here. And what's going to happen to the level of unemployment? Now, maybe temporarily it's going to go right here. Let's say that, temporarily, inflation goes to 5% and unemployment in this case maybe drops to 3%. But what's going to happen is that it's going to adjust to the long run right here, and inflation has gone up, but the non-accelerating inflation rate of employment, it stays the same here. So point A leads to point B, and there's just a increase. The expectation has been kind of accounted for, and unemployment, while temporarily in the short run, the SRPC, you're going to see a movement along the SRPC. The shift has no long run effect. So we talked about inflation. Well, what about the opposite? First, we'll talk about disinflation. So disinflation is slowing the rate of inflation, and so this is a policy that might take place when inflation rates are high, when you have maybe not hyperinflation, but you have chronic inflation. Sometimes the government might take steps to curb the levels of inflation. Again, generally speaking, we're living in times of low inflation, so it might be a little bit harder to grasp from a personal standpoint. But there have been periods of time in U.S. history where inflation rates, people expected higher levels of inflation, and there's this almost self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts where people expected high rates of inflation, and there was. So, mortgages used to be in the double digits. Today you're dealing with 3%, 4% mortgages. Those were unheard of in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So times have changed. Generally, politicians and economists have found that bringing inflation down is much harder than increasing it. So the policy of once you have inflation, imagine that you're trying to take the punch bowl away from the party. It's much difficult to end the party once it has begun than actually start the party itself, right? In the early 1980s, so this was when Ronald Reagan had just been elected president. You had seen high periods of inflation. One of the reasons, big reasons why Jimmy Carter lost the election in 1980 was the economy was stagnating. You had some stagflation. The United States used contractionary policies which would bring about disinflation. So right when Reagan came to office, there was this period of time where the contractionary measures were used to bring down inflation. So policymakers, they reasoned that the long-term benefit of controlling double-digit inflation was worth the short-term pain that totaled an equivalent of nearly $2.6 trillion using 2010 dollars. So contractionary policies, including contractionary fiscal policies, but also monetary policies. Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, raised interest rates to try to bring this level of inflation down, and it did have a short-term consequence. But eventually, the United States rebounded, and the economy, did well shortly thereafter. So one way to kind of limit the damage that contractionary policies will wreak on the economy is having a clear policy of announcing of a policy of disinflation. Some economists argue helped in easing the pain. So if it's clearly announced and for what reason, then it's the idea that it's going to limit some of the inevitable pain it's going to cause towards an economy. Now, the costs of deflation, now you can argue it's going in the same direction, but whereas disinflation is controlling high levels of inflation, deflation is closely associated with a recession and maybe even a depression, so to speak, right? So when deflation occurs, price levels are actually going below, meaning that the purchasing power is greater today than it would be the following year. And that's basically what deflation is. Or you can call it a negative inflation rate. So deflation is the fall in the aggregate price level, which was a common occurrence before World War II in the United States. So this is a phenomenon that actually happened quite frequently, but you don't see a whole lot of this deflation happening in today's economy, or at least when it does, the Fed is usually pretty active in responding. So after World War II, inflation became more of the norm, particularly after 1971, when President Nixon took the United States completely off the gold standard. But in the 1990s, deflation reemerged in Japan. Now, again, I asked before, now why is deflation bad? I mean, aren't lower prices good? And again, just like inflation has winners and losers, inflation benefits those that are debtors and it hurts savers, hurts lenders. So if you're a farmer in the 1890s and you've taken out a lot of loans, then you like inflation. If you're a bank, you don't like inflation as much, right? Whereas if you are a senior citizen and prices are lower and you hold on to a lot of cash, you love deflation. But generally, it's not good for businesses because in a deflationary environment, there's less incentive to invest. And this idea, if people expect prices to fall, then people are going to hoard onto their cash. And this is the idea of this paradox of thrift. What may be good individually is not going to be good as an economy. And Japan went through this, right? So in deflation, lenders gain and borrowers lose since the dollar has more purchasing power in the future. So there's less incentive to invest in the economy during this deflationary climate here. So this effect of deflation ultimately leads to a reduction of the aggregate demand. And again, what is that equation, the macroeconomic equation? Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, which is net exports. So deflation leads to this aggregate demand decreasing because business investment would go down, consumer expenditures goes down. So Y goes down as a result. Again, which many economists will argue played a significant role in the Great Depression. So a lot of economists, including former chairman Ben Bernanke, he would argue that during this period of reduction of aggregate demand, it was a role of the Federal Reserve to use expansionary monetary policy, lowering interest rates. It was a role of the government to lower taxes to combat this reduction of aggregate demand. And again, it's argued by many economists, including former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, that the Fed made terrible mistakes in not doing what it did. And part of what happened in 2008 with the Fed taking this activist approach, it's up to history in the future to judge whether or not what Bernanke and the Fed did was something that averted a great disaster, or perhaps, it created, it sowed the seeds for a future bubble. I mean, or it did both, right? So again, you don't know exactly, but that's the theory behind why deflation is so bad, and the idea that the Fed should take this activist approach in trying to prevent deflation. So what happened in Japan? So how would a central bank fight a deflationary onset? So how do you fight deflation? Well, the answer is you try to stimulate the economy through the use of aggregate demand. Again, fiscal policy, it's worth writing down here. Fiscal policy equals and let's use expansionary. So expansionary fiscal policy equals lower taxes, increase government spending, or increase government transfers, which is similar to lowering taxes. But this is fiscal policy. A central bank is not fiscal policy. A central bank, let's see where there's space here. Central bank deals with expansionary monetary policy. Now, there are three tools, again, conventional tools. The three tools are going to be to decrease the required reserve ratio. So decrease the amount that banks are required to hold in their reserves. You could lower the discount rate. So this is the rate at which banks can borrow directly from the Fed. Now, in this case, it would be directly borrowing from the Bank of Japan, which is the Federal Reserve equivalent in Japan, or you buy government securities. Buy government securities. Now, you do this, you buy government securities, and in doing so, you lower the target Fed funds rate. Again, I'm applying the U.S. solution, the equivalent of what the U.S. would do if it were in Japan's situation. Now, here's the problem here. So you can enact one of these measures, and again, usually the U.S. Fed will try to buy government securities to try to get the federal funds rate down closer to zero. But here's the problem. What happened in Japan and what the U.S. is experiencing right now is, what if, again, use expansionary monetary policy by reducing interest rates. But the question is, what if interest rates are already at 0%, which is what it was in Japan? Well, if you keep on buying government securities to try to get the federal funds rate down and down, you can't go below 0%. It doesn't work that way. So the economic terminology when you hit that 0% is you're fighting in a liquidity trap, which is a situation in which conventional monetary policy is ineffective because nominal interest rates are up against the zero bound. So as much as you'd want to encourage more and more borrowing, you've hit the limit. You've trapped yourself at that 0%. So the alternative is there's two things you can now do. You can keep it at that 0%, or you can raise the interest rates. But by doing that, it's going to actually discourage more borrowing. And again, the whole goal is that you want to encourage borrowing. So again, you're trapped. That's why it's called this liquidity trap. So in Japan, in the late 1980s, it was a time of economic boom in the stock market and the real estate market. Japan was doing really well economically. And then what ended up happening, but the Bank of Japan found itself in a liquidity trap and saw a persistent level of deflation beginning in the mid-1990s. And combined with this aging population, which quite honestly didn't mind deflation because it benefited senior citizens, you had a problem with the growing commitment that Japan had to its senior citizens and the inability of its population to get younger. As it was aging, you had a combination of factors that made it very difficult economic times in Japan. So example number one. So let's take a look at how this would play out here. The long run Phillips curve is it horizontal? Let's take a look. Definitely not horizontal. None of these long run curves is generally going to be vertical, and that's exactly what it is. Definitely is vertical. Is it the short run Phillips curve plus inflation? That's just a silly answer. So it's definitely not one. It is two. But let's go ahead and put a star next to this. It's not three. Can't be 1 and 3. And it's definitely not 1, 2, and 3. So the correct answer is 2 only. The LRPC is going to be a straight vertical curve here. And this is how it's going to be drawn here. So you have unemployment. And you have inflation right here. And again, you want to put the inflation percentage and unemployment percentage here. And it's going to be a straight vertical line down here. It's going to be labeled the LRPC. And where the LRPC is at the x-axis, that is the NAIRU, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So that's basically what the long-run Phillips curve is. Again, it doesn't hurt to draw the SRPC right here, which is the short-run Phillips curve. Okay, example number 2. An increase in expected inflation will do which of the following here. So is it going to shift the SRPC downward? We'll take a look at that. Is it going to shift the SRP? There's an increase in expected inflation, then it's going to go the opposite way. Is it going to shift the SRPC upward? Absolutely. We're going to start this. Is it going to shift the LRPC upward? Now the LRPC is going to stay the same. Is it going to shift the LRPC downward? No, it's going to stay the same here. And because B is the answer, E is not the answer, so the correct answer is going to be shift the short-run Phillips curve upward. Now, let's go ahead and graph out how this is going to look like. Again, you have the unemployment rate. Yeah, a lot of times on the multiple choice questions, it's just going to be an A, B, C, or D, but it's definitely going to help if you're able to draw out the graphs to understand what's being said. And again, you will see questions like this on the FRQ as well, so it's also good to be able to draw accurately. So here's the SRPC here, and then you're going to have the LRPC. And if there's an increase in expected inflation here, again, let's call this NAIRU, this point of NAIRU here. If there's an increase of expected inflation, then it's going to shift it upwards here. And the inflation rate is going to increase from I1 to I2. But notice the unemployment rate has stayed pretty much the same. So again, there's no correlation in the long run between unemployment and inflation. In the short run, yes, but not in the long run. Okay. Example number 3 here. Draw a correctly labeled graph showing an SRPC with an inflation rate of 2% and the NAIRU at 5% here. So let's draw this point in equilibrium here. So I've done this with the other problems, but now this is a much bigger graph here. So this is the inflation rate. So the percentage here. And here's the unemployment percentage. And you have the SRPC, a downward sloping line right here. You have the SRPC, label this as 1. And then you have the LRPC. Okay. And let's call this 2% right here. And this is the 5%, which is the NAIRU. So assume that you are in equilibrium, and basically that's what it is. So it's actually not that hard. It's this is again one of the maybe 6 or 7 graphs that are essential in the AP macro test. And again, there's really not a whole lot to it aside from understanding this inverse relationship in the short run and the straight vertical line in the long run. Once you get that, this graph should be a piece of cake. Okay, and the final example. Assume an economy is in a recession. So let's assume this recession. Again, when you're drawing an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, the potential output is going to be to the right of the actual output. But again, on this graph here, don't be confused. When you see the recession, draw exactly what you would do otherwise, and then you want to be able to analyze where the points would be to see where recession would occur on a Phillips curve. So assume an economy is in a recession, draw a correctly labeled graph showing the following: the SRPC, LRPC, and point A, which represents the current state of recession. So there's going to be multiple answers, but you have to be on the right side, not the right side, the correct side of the LRPC. So it's either to the right or to the left. So let's graph to see which one would be the correct answer here. So again, this is the inflation percentage, and this is the unemployment percentage. So you draw the SRPC here, SRPC1, and you have the LRPC1. Okay. Now again, this is going to be, this is the NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment here. All right, so this might be the, let's label this as E here, and let's label this as I star here, where it's in equilibrium here. NAIRU, let's label it as U1. Okay, so what is the point of recession? So here's the $1 million question. Is it going to be to the right, or is it going to be to the left of the LRPC? Well, let's examine what each of them would indicate. So if you're on the left of the LRPC, what you're indicating is relatively higher inflation and lower unemployment, and that's more of an inflationary gap more so than a recessionary. So you're going to have low unemployment. That's definitely not a recession. And you're going to have high inflation. So that definitely wouldn't be the case. So you don't go to the left side. So obviously it would be the right side. So this would be a point A. So if they're looking for a point that could represent the economy in a state of recession, it would be point A, because inflation would be relatively low. So let's label this as I1. Now, if it's deflation, then it's actually going to be below right here and high levels of unemployment. That's why the SRPC actually can cross through the x-axis here. And let's assume that the NAIRU was 6%. You might have like an 8% unemployment, which, again, it's consistent. In a recession, the real GDP is lower, and therefore, in periods of a recession with a lower GDP, it goes to reason that the unemployment rate is going to be high as well. So again, if you want to see the connection between unemployment and inflation in the short run and in the long run, then you want to be able to get this on the SRPC, LRPC. These are very easy graphs to go over and memorize, and so it definitely is in your best interest to get this squared away before the AP exam. Thank you for watching educator.com.